Hi, it's Iftach. One of the more interesting things that came up after my recent video on ultrasonic recordings is a discussion that evolved regarding the perceived size of an object when it's being slowed down. A particular example that triggered this discussion was a recording of a toothpick. When slowed down 16 times, the sound of the toothpick morphs into something much larger and resembles a bigger piece of wood. Following this discussion, I decided to carry a little experiment and analysis. So the goal was to compare two wooden cylinders in different sizes. The first would be a big cylinder of 60 times 3 centimeters, and the second would be a small cylinder of 4 centimeters times 2 millimeters. So I wanted to carry a comparison and slow down the smaller cylinder by a factor of 15, effectively matching it to the size of the bigger cylinder, and examine the similarities of the sounds that they produce. So the reason I chose down 15 and not 16, which would equal 4 octaves, is that finding a piece of wood with a diameter of 32 millimeters is not so easy off the shelf, whereas finding a piece of wood with a diameter of 3 centimeters or 30 millimeters is pretty easy. Yeah, so it was merely a practical reason. Slowing down by a factor of 15 is corresponding to 47 semitones and 11 cents. The small cylinder is crafted from a toothpick, which is made out of birch wood, and the big cylinder is crafted from beech wood. Although I could not match the wood exactly, the density factor of the two types of wood is fairly similar, with about 5 to 6% difference. So the small difference in density means that while the two types of wood would have slightly different physical properties, their acoustic behaviors should be relatively close for practical purposes. So for the larger piece of wood, I used the hardwood mallet to strike it in the middle. I avoided using excessive force, as this method effectively minimizes overtones and emphasizes the fundamental, resulting in a cleaner sound, which would be easier to understand. For the smaller piece, I mounted it on a clamp and struck it with the head of a sewing pin. This was very tricky. It took me quite a while because of the size of the object, but I did manage in the end. The recording was made with my Sade 19 microphones, which can capture frequencies up to 90 kilohertz, and everything was recorded in 24 bits, 192 kilohertz. Let's start by listening to the recording. So the first thing you'll notice is that the fundamental frequencies are pretty close. Of course, there are some timbre differences, but that's expected. So what I found fascinating, and is kind of the point of this video, is that when the recording of the smaller piece of wood is being slowed down, it starts to sound remarkably similar to the bigger piece of wood. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to do is to carry out some analysis on the audio files. I started by looking into the harmonic content and plotted the two spectrograms of the two recordings, first of the bigger wood and the normal speed recording of the smaller wood. And as we can immediately see, the smaller wood produces much more high frequency content, but that's also to be expected. The next thing I did was to compare the spectrograms of the bigger piece of wood and the smaller piece of wood being slowed down by a factor of 15. And even the naked eye could spot similarities in the overtone structure. And to complete this, we can also plot the harmonic difference between the two recordings. And if we quantify it, and if we look at the mean square error, it produces something around 4.2, which indicates that the harmonic content of the two recordings is relatively similar, actually, with some discrepancies. And these differences are likely due to factors such as slight pitch variations and the way I excited them, and of course the material of the wood. But given the context of this experiment, where we have two different types of wood which are scaled, the relatively low mean square error actually supports the idea that they do behave the same when you slow them down, which is pretty cool. So the next thing I did was to check for cosine similarity on the two spectrograms. Cosine similarity basically looks at the angle of two vectors. In our case, the vectors are the spectrograms, and a value of 1 means that something is identical. And in our case, the similarity value is 0.997 or something like this, which is extremely high, which further supports the idea that the small wood behaves similar to the bigger wood when it's being played slow down. Afterwards, I looked into dynamic time warping. Dynamic time warping is a technique that used to assess how two sequences evolve over time. If we apply it on harmonic sequences, it measures how the harmonic content evolves over time, basically, in comparison to each other. This produced a very, very high value, which means that they do not match, actually. But this is also expected because the bigger piece of wood has much more sustain, and the smaller piece of wood produces much more reverb tail because we increase the room size by a factor of 15 as well, and this is also contributing to the differences. And finally, although it's very easy to hear, I also wanted to compare the fundamental frequency of the two recordings, and it seems that there's an average difference of around 7.3 Hertz, which is equivalent to around 0.42 semitones if we consider the two fundamental frequencies of the two pieces of wood to be around 300 Hertz, which confirms that they are very close in their fundamental frequency. So this was my short analysis. What fascinates me the most, or even touches me on a deeply emotional level somehow, is the idea that there are so many similarities between objects of different sizes. It's like the same principle that shaped their sounds is being scaled up or down, and it reveals this bigger connection between things that otherwise seems pretty different. So this was it. I leave a link to the GitHub repository, which contains the notebook and the sounds if you want to download it and try it out yourself. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.